And you mentioned the work you're doing at UCLA, and I wanted to ask you about that because I know that you've done lots of research into mindfulness, and I'd love for you to share with us a bit more about some of the neuroscience behind it. Why does mindfulness work? Why does it help people so much?
So just to say, our center is a research center, but we're also primarily an education center, and we've done about like 15 different studies, but compared to some big mindfulness research centers, we're pretty small. We're more focused on the education. And some of the studies that we have done include, we've done studies looking at mindfulness and its impact on insomnia in older adults. We've done studies on mindfulness in ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We've done studies on younger breast cancer survivors and how it might help increase their quality of life and reduce anxiety and depression symptoms. We're currently doing a study right now for Alzheimer's caregivers, so seeing if that might help also relieving stress, reducing anxiety, reducing burnout. So we've done probably, like I said, 15 or plus studies, and the wider field of mindfulness and research is quite significant, but it's still very young. So that's something to keep in mind, that even though there's probably been 5,000-6,000 studies, that's a small amount. So if you were to say, oh, well, if how many studies are there out there telling you that heart disease is positively impacted by exercise, you would probably find, I think it's around 60,000 studies. Okay. So you can see how new the mindfulness field is. Now, the thing is, although it's been researched a lot for the last 30 years, more in the last decade. So that being said, there's lots of promising and exciting results, but they need to be replicated. Right, there needs to be
absolutely
more and more studies done, and so they look at all sorts of things: health measures, physical health, impact on stress, impact on inflammation, impact on our healing response, on boosting the immune system, chronic pain. The research around chronic pain and mindfulness is quite robust. That it helps people with a symptom reduction, but also ability to tolerate the difficulties of living with chronic pain.
And so that's back to Jon Kabat-Zinn's work. I remember I heard him speak in London a few years ago, and he was talking all about that. That's where I think a lot of it started. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So Jon Kabat-Zinn is really one of the main people who brought mindfulness, not the only one, but brought mindfulness out into these like more medical and secular contexts. And they started research, and the first research they were doing was on chronic pain and mindfulness. And their program, Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, MBSR, was developed initially for that. And of course, it's grown in all sorts of ways. But that's the reason there's the most research, because it's one of the earliest, it was maybe the earliest intervention created. So there is a lot of research looking at, I mean, not a lot, but some research looking at neuroscience. And one of the early studies that I've always enjoyed was one where they looked at advanced meditators, people who'd been meditating in caves in the Himalayas for decades, and they looked at their brain and they compared it to people of the same age range, like, you know, like us looking into the, like a view, sort of like a slice. Yeah. And what they saw was that the prefrontal cortex in advanced meditators was thicker than the people who had not meditated. And this is really important because the prefrontal cortex is what we think of as the CEO of our brain, right? It's responsible for executive functioning, delayed gratification, working memory, flexible thinking, and so on. So these studies are great, except they weren't longitudinal. So we don't know if a person with a thick prefrontal cortex is attracted to meditation, or it became that way because they spent 40 years meditating in a cave.
Is it there's been some causation? Yeah, exactly.
And there's been some research where they've looked at novice meditators and seen minute brain changes in beginners over, I think one study was 27 minutes a day of practice over 8 weeks.
Okay.
So those are some of the kind of classic studies that people are very excited about, and there's more to do. Someone at UCLA was looking at longer term meditators have more cortical folds. So that's a desirable thing to have in terms of your brain
complexity, essentially.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. More connectivity and more neurons. So lastly, we just published a study, just mention it because it's kind of interesting. We published a study where we they looked at it was connected to a video game. It was kind of bizarre, but it was a video game that's about donating and giving money to different organizations through the video game. And they had people practice meditation and wanted to see if they would be more generous. And it turned out that they were. Those who learned the mindfulness meditation were more generous in the video game in donating. So anyway, just there's so much research.
It's like that compassion going out for others and the brain changing through that. I'd love to ask you a little bit more about the study you did with ADHD, because I coach people with ADHD. So I'd love to know just what were the main findings from that? Did you find anything that the mindfulness was particularly helpful for those groups?
Yeah, so this study was done with Lydia Zalewska, who has written a book on mindfulness and ADD, and it was a pilot study. So there are other people doing really interesting work with attention, particularly someone named Amishi Jha, who's in University of Miami. But our study was a pilot study. We had adults and adolescents, and they went through an 8-week protocol that was similar to MBSR, but designed specifically for them. And similar to our program, MAPS, Mindful Awareness Practices, that we offer through UCLA. It's like an equivalent in some ways, not completely, to MBSR. The main findings were interesting. They got pretty good findings, so much so that some of the scientists looked at the data and they said, well, what medication did you put them on? And then we said, no, it was meditation with a T, not a C. But one of the things that they found was that first of all, like kids could do it. Like we weren't even sure that children who identified as ADHD would be able to do it, and they absolutely were. So that was a good thing to know. But secondly, they did a bunch of measures looking at attention, and one of the measures is there's different types of attention, but one type of attention is conflict attention. So conflict attention is paying attention to one thing when you're being distracted by multiple things. And how do you do it? And typically kids or adults with ADHD, they don't do that very well. They just get pulled into everything. But there was a significant improvement in that particular measure of their ability to stay focused. So lots more work to do, but that's kind of like the basic territory of it.
Really interesting. That's I'm definitely, I'll have to have a look a bit more into the work that you've done. That sounds amazing and a really useful thing to know with some of my clients, I think. So I also wanted to talk to you about the book that you published last year, Diana, The Little Book of Being. And I just wondered what prompted you, what made you think it was the right time for this book, and what new is it bringing to the world of mindfulness?
Well, I'm going to go back to my time in the monastery a little bit to say why this book arose. But there's different ways of practicing mindfulness. And the short answer to your question is that I think what's been popularized in the mindfulness field is something that's very sort of, it's just one aspect of how we can be mindful. So this idea that I think if you were just to read it in a newspaper or someone's talking about mindfulness, you pay attention to something that's happening. Usually you're breathing, your attention wanders, you bring it back. And that's the skill we were teaching those kids in the ADD study. And it was really, really, it's a very valuable thing to do. But the fact is there's many, many ways of practicing mindfulness that are not just paying attention to something focused. So we can also practice being aware of thoughts and emotions, which is also popularized to a certain degree. But what is not so well known in the field is the way we can practice a more expansive, broader mindfulness that is connected to something called awareness, which I refer to as awareness of awareness. So in other words, not only are we aware of all the things we're happening, our thoughts and our emotions, our breath, the sounds, but we can also notice that which is aware of that. And this shows up in a lot of different schools of Buddhism and Hinduism. So for people who are familiar with Advaita Vedanta, where you're asking the question, in some of the practices, you're asking the question, who is noticing, or who is experiencing this? It shows up in Tibetan Buddhist practice, Dzogchen and Mahamudra, but none of that seemed to me to have made its way into the popular culture of mindfulness, and I felt like it was a problem, that there were that there are so many ways to deepen one's practice and go and have other types of experiences. And so I call this natural awareness, and natural awareness is this wide open, spacious, somewhat effortless state of being that one can access through meditation, but also can access in life. So the interesting thing is that when, as I started to teach about it, so many people said to me things like, "Oh, well, I've had that experience. I remember as a child just sitting outside and feeling deeply connected on the dock of on a lake, or being with my pet, or with our children, or something, like this quality of awareness that you don't have to work so hard to get, but it's part of what it means to be human." And this is why I call it natural awareness. So many of us have had that experience of being out in nature and just this settling in and this depth of connection to ourselves. So it can arise through these somewhat more advanced meditative practices, and it can also be recognized and welcomed through just our everyday life. And so that was my intention with the book. And then the reason I mentioned the monastery at the beginning of when you asked me the question is just that I had been practicing in the very classical mindfulness ways of paying attention to my breathing. My attention wandered. And after a period of practice of many months, I realized that I found myself just sort of burning out on that sort of effort-based practice of like practicing for a goal, do well, get your A, get your check plus in meditation. And I realized that I needed to do a much more open, spacious, relaxed practice. And so that was the start of where I began learning those practices, which later, 20 years later, became part of my book.
Yeah. And that sounds wonderful, because I think particularly when people first come to mindfulness and meditation, I know this was my experience, it felt like it was really hard work. And I was like, I'm doing it, I'm not doing it. And then you beat yourself up, and then you leave it for a bit, and then you go, no, I'm going to try again. I must try harder. And it kind of becomes another way of beating yourself up to feel that there's actually another way that doesn't have to be so much hard work. Sounds incredibly powerful, and quite welcome, actually, that it doesn't have to be so difficult.
Absolutely. People can be very hard on themselves.